I arrived at the cemetery wearing the same duffel bag I had carried across 2 years of military service. I had imagined hugs, tears, and a warm welcome. Instead, I found a crowd gathered around a polished black headstone. My headstone. I stopped behind a row of trees and stared. Ethan Carter, beloved son, husband, and hero. My hands shook. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "A military reporting mistake." That was the only explanation. Then I saw my wife, Olivia. My chest tightened. She stood beside the grave, dressed in black. At first, I thought she was crying for me. Then I heard her speak. "We need to settle this soon," Olivia said. "The insurance company can't keep delaying payment." My stomach dropped. My brother Ryan crossed his arms. "You're not getting all of it." Olivia rolled her eyes. "Why wouldn't I? I was his wife." "You were his wife," Ryan replied. "But I'm family too." "I'm family," my mother, Margaret, interrupted sharply. "I carried him for 9 months. Don't act like I deserve nothing." I stared at them in disbelief. Nobody mentioned missing me. Nobody mentioned loving me. Only money. Ryan pointed toward the grave. "Ethan would want me taken care of." Olivia laughed. "You haven't spoken to him properly in years." "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Margaret stepped closer. "Stop arguing. We all suffered." Olivia folded her arms. "Suffered?" "Ethan spent 2 years overseas. I was the one left alone." I felt another stab in my chest. Left alone? Every lonely night, every dangerous mission, every sacrifice had been for them. Ryan shook his head. "You'll already get the house." And? "And that's enough." Olivia's expression hardened. "Not for me." The funeral guests slowly drifted away, while the three of them continued arguing beside my grave. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother sighed dramatically. "The insurance payout is substantial. We should divide it fairly." "Fairly?" Olivia snapped. "I sacrificed more than anyone." Ryan scoffed. "You sacrificed?" "Ethan was the one getting shot at." "Exactly," Olivia replied. "And now he's gone." Gone. The word echoed through my mind. I was standing less than 50 feet away. Alive. Breathing. Listening. Yet they talked about me as if I were nothing more than a check waiting to clear. My mother lowered her voice. "Let's stay calm. People are still nearby." Ryan glanced around. "Fine, but I'm not walking away empty-handed." Olivia looked at both of them with obvious irritation. "Honestly, you're both making this harder than it needs to be." "What does that mean?" Ryan asked. "It means Ethan is dead." My jaw clenched. She continued without hesitation. "The money belongs to the living." A cold silence followed. Then my mother nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true." I felt sick. Every memory I treasured suddenly seemed worthless. Birthdays. Family dinners. Anniversaries. The promises Olivia once made. Had any of it been real? Ryan kicked a stone across the grass. "So what's your plan?" Olivia looked directly at my headstone. For one impossible moment, I thought I saw sadness in her eyes. Then she spoke. "Maybe this sounds terrible." "What?" Ryan asked. Olivia shrugged. "Ethan's death may have been the best thing that ever happened to me." The world seemed to stop around me, and my heart shattered. For the next several days, I stayed hidden. Every morning, I reminded myself that what I had heard at my own funeral could not possibly represent the whole truth. Every evening, I discovered something worse. I rented a small room under a different name and spent my days watching the people I once loved. The first person I followed was Ryan. I watched him leave a restaurant carrying folders and paperwork. Later that afternoon, he sat with two men inside a coffee shop. "I'll have the money soon," Ryan said confidently. "Are you sure?" one of them asked. Ryan smiled. "Absolutely. The insurance payout is just delayed." "What kind of business are you planning?" "A construction company." "That's a big investment." Ryan leaned back. "My brother spent years earning that money. It would be stupid not to use it." I felt my stomach twist. One of the men laughed. "Sounds like your brother is financing your future." Ryan raised his coffee cup. "Without realizing it." The men laughed together. I walked away before I heard more. That night I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I followed my mother. She met a real estate agent outside a large house. "This place is beautiful," she said. "It has 5 bedrooms," the agent replied. "And the price?" "Within the budget you mentioned." My mother smiled. "Good." The agent opened the front door. "Would you like a tour?" "Of course." Several minutes later, I stood near an open window and listened. "I deserve something better," my mother said. "This home would certainly be an upgrade. It will be perfect after the insurance money arrives." I closed my eyes. My death had become a shopping plan. My sacrifice had become an opportunity. I wanted to believe Olivia was different. I wanted one person to prove me wrong. Instead, she destroyed the last piece of hope I had left. 3 days later, I followed her to a small park outside town. She checked her phone repeatedly. Then a man approached. Tall, confident, expensive suit. Olivia smiled the moment she saw him. A smile I hadn't seen in years. The man wrapped his arms around her. "I missed you," he said. "I missed you too." My chest tightened. The man kissed her forehead. "Everything going according to plan?" Olivia nodded. "Almost." "Any problems?" "Ryan and Margaret are fighting over money." The man laughed. "They'll survive." I listened from behind a row of trees. "Once the payout arrives," Olivia said, "everything changes." That's what I wanted to hear. I watched him take her hand. "Derek, are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "Do you love me?" "Yes." "Then we're doing the right thing." The name hit me immediately. Derek Mason. A stranger who seemed far too comfortable touching my wife. Olivia smiled. "We can finally travel." Derek nodded. "Paris first. And Italy. And Greece?" She laughed softly. "What about the investment account?" "I already have plans for it." "Our future is going to be incredible." Their future. Built on money connected to my supposed death. I struggled to breathe. Had our marriage meant anything? Had every promise been a lie? Derek pulled her closer. "No more pretending." "No more pretending," Olivia agreed. Then she kissed him. Not briefly. Not by accident. Like two people celebrating victory. When they finally separated, Olivia smiled. Our new life is finally beginning. And in that moment, whatever remained of my heart broke completely. I arrived at Lucas Reed's apartment late evening, unsure how to explain everything. "I thought you were dead," Ethan Lucas said, standing up from his chair. "I know I said, but I need your help." "What happened over there? Tell me everything." I told him about the funeral and what I saw. "That's insane. Your family thinks you're dead and they're fighting over money." "You're not going back there alone. I have to see the truth myself." "Then we plan this carefully." We spent days thinking of every possibility. If they are hiding something, we will find it. Part of me wanted revenge, another part wanted answers. Finally, I returned home. The moment I stepped inside, everything went silent. My mother dropped the plate and shouted, "Ethan." Ryan turned pale and said, "This can't be." Olivia stared like she had seen a ghost. They rushed toward me, asking how I was alive. I stayed calm and said I just came back. I watched every reaction, carefully hiding my truth. Later, I noticed Olivia deleting messages quickly from her phone. "Just clean this up," she whispered. Something bigger was still hidden, and I would find it. "You need proof, Ethan, not just feelings," Lucas said. "Then I will get proof," I said. "We'll check surveillance near your house. If they see me alive, everything changes." That's the point. We drove back together in silence. My heart raced as I approached my home again. I opened the door slowly and stepped inside. "Ethan, is it really you?" my mother cried. "You're supposed to be dead," Ryan shouted. Olivia whispered, "No, this can't happen." "I'm right here," I said quietly. But I noticed their eyes exchanging fear. Olivia stepped aside, quickly deleting messages from her phone. "Just erase everything now," she muttered. I realized then the truth was far worse than I imagined. "You saw it, didn't you?" Lucas asked on phone. "Yes, they're hiding something bigger." "Then be careful from now on." I looked at my family, pretending nothing had changed. I caught Olivia desperately deleting more messages as I watched. Her hands were shaking, as if she was hiding a crime. I knew I was no longer just a soldier coming home. I was something they feared. "We need to talk later." "Not now," she said too fast. "Stop acting strange in front of him." I smiled, knowing they were already trapped. "Don't trust any of them, Ethan." "I won't." That night, I lay awake replaying every word they said. I realized trust had been the real casualty. Everything I loved was now under suspicion, and I was no longer hiding. I watched Olivia one more time from the hallway. She kept deleting messages faster when she thought no one was looking. This has to disappear completely. Everything is getting out of control. We should never have discussed it so openly. I stepped back into the shadows, knowing my return had already changed everything, and they would never see me coming again soon. I settled back into daily life, quietly watching everything around me. Olivia said, "You're acting different, Ethan." I replied, "Just tired." Ryan avoided me completely and said, "Not now." Something was off in every conversation. I told Lucas they are hiding something more. He said, "Then we bring in Sarah Bennett." Sarah said I need every document connected to the claim. I asked, "What do you see?" She replied, "Irregular signatures and rushed approvals." Lucas said, "That means fraud." Sarah nodded, "Possibly." Olivia whispered, "We should be careful." Ryan said, "Stop talking about money here." I watched everything closely. Sarah said, "Someone benefited before verification." I said, "From my death." She replied, "From your status change." Lucas asked, "Can we prove it?" Sarah said, "We will try." I noticed fear in Olivia's eyes. Ryan said, "This is getting dangerous." Olivia said, "We should act normal." Sarah added, "There is a forged document here." I said, "Show me." She placed it on table. It had my name on it. I said, "This is fake." Sarah said, "But it was filed officially." Lucas said, "Then someone planned this." Olivia dropped her phone and said, "This isn't what it looks like." Ryan said we didn't know. I said, "I want truth now." Sarah said, "Then we go deeper." I realized my house was built on lies. Trust is gone, I said. Lucas said, now it's war for truth. I stared at everyone silently. I felt the weight of everything collapsing around me. Lucas said, we need to plan next steps carefully. Sarah said, I will trace every transaction linked to claim. I asked, how deep does this go? She replied, deeper than your family knows. Olivia called from across the room, Ethan, wait. I said, what do you want now? She hesitated and said, we need to talk alone. Ryan interrupted, not happening. Sarah said, you should all cooperate. I replied, cooperation requires honesty. Lucas said, we are running out of time. I looked at the forged document again. It felt heavier than anything I had held. Sarah said this signature was copied. I said then, who signed it? Lucas said, someone close to you. Olivia whispered, that is not true. Sarah said, evidence suggests otherwise. I said, I want every answer now. Lucas said, we will expose this. Sarah said, starting with this document. I felt my world split again. Olivia said, you don't understand anything. Ryan said, this is not over. I said, it is for me. I stood there watching them all pretend nothing had happened. Lucas placed a hand on my shoulder and said, stay focused. Sarah said, I will get warrants if needed. Olivia said quietly, this is ruining everything. Ryan said, we need control of this situation. I said, control is already gone. Lucas said, then we take it back step by step. Sarah said, this is only beginning. I looked at Olivia and said, truth always comes out. I realized nothing in this house was ever real anymore, and I would uncover everything. Sarah's investigation uncovered evidence that Olivia and Derek were already making plans for the insurance payout. Ryan helped with paperwork, believing I would never come home. I asked Sarah what she found. She said, the documents show coordination before your death was confirmed. I felt my chest tighten. I went to Ryan and said, we need to talk. He looked down and said, I thought you were gone for good. I said, that doesn't justify what you did. He whispered, I signed papers I shouldn't have. I asked, who influenced you? Sarah said it was pressure from Olivia and Derek. My stomach dropped. I said, tell me everything. He admitted, they said it was just paperwork, nothing illegal. I shook my head and said, you helped them take advantage of me. He said, I didn't think you'd ever come back. I walked away feeling betrayed. My mother interrupted and said, everyone was just preparing for survival. I said, by stealing from me? She replied, don't twist this. Arguments broke out every day. I told Sarah, this is bigger than I thought. She said, it's a coordinated financial fraud chain. I felt everything connecting. Ryan came to me secretly and said, I have something for you. He added, this proves Olivia knew everything. I said, why are you helping me now? He said, because I finally realized what I did. I took the file silently. Sarah said, this changes everything again. I replied, now I see the full picture. My mother shouted, you are destroying this family. I said, this family destroyed itself. Silence filled the room. I looked at Ryan and said, thank you for telling me the truth. He nodded and said, I'm sorry. I said, this is not over. Sarah added, we will trace every transaction next. I felt the weight of betrayal fully now. Ryan said quietly, Olivia pushed hardest. I asked, where is she now? He said, with Derek, planning next move. I clenched my fists. Sarah said, we can still stop them. I said, then we will. Ryan handed me a final document. He said, this is everything I have left. I looked at it and realized Olivia's signature was on it. Sarah said, that confirms intent. I whispered, she really did it. Ryan said, I'm done lying. I nodded slowly. Sarah said, "We move legally now." I said, "Good. Let it all come out." I felt everything collapsing into clarity. Ryan said, "Whatever happens, I accept it." I said, "You should have said that earlier." Sarah packed the documents carefully. I asked, "What happens next?" She said, "We expose everything step by step." I exhaled slowly. Ryan said, "Olivia will fight back." I replied, "Let her try." Sarah said, "This is only the beginning." I looked at the file again, knowing everything had changed. Ryan said quietly, "I hope this ends right." I said, "We will end this properly and bring every hidden truth into the light, no matter what it costs anyone involved, including Olivia and Derek, both from tonight." Armed with evidence, I stood between justice and revenge. Lucas said, "You should make them pay for what they did." Sarah said, "We need patience. Let the law handle everything." Ryan called me and said, "I made mistakes. I need forgiveness." My mother said everyone was just trying to survive, nothing more. I walked alone for days thinking about everything I had lost. Lucas said, "If you want justice, we go all the way." I replied, "Justice without control becomes destruction, not healing." Sarah said, "Then choose carefully what kind of future you want." I thought about my missions overseas and everything I had seen. People break easily when truth hits harder than bullets. I learned that. Finally, I said, "I will expose everything, but I will not become like them." Lucas said, "Good. That means you are still yourself." Sarah said, "Then we begin legal action immediately." I nodded and said, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Legal notices were prepared and filed under Sarah's guidance. I said, "No more. Hiding everything must come into the open." Ryan texted me later saying, "Olivia and Derek are panicking." I replied, "They should be. They built this on lies." Lucas said, "Once notices arrive, there is no turning back." I said, "I am not afraid anymore." Sarah said, "Good, because this will escalate quickly." I stood alone and accepted the weight of my decision. Lucas said, "I will stand with you until the end." Sarah said, "The system will now take over." I said, "Let it take everything that needs to be exposed." Courier arrived at dawn with official envelopes. Lucas said, "That is the beginning of consequences." I watched from distance as everything started unfolding. Sarah said, "Both Olivia and Derek have been formally notified." I said, "Then the truth is officially in motion." Lucas said, "They cannot stop it now." I said, "Good. I never wanted silence anymore." Sarah said, "From here every lie will surface." I said, "Then let the world see everything." Lucas said, "Stay strong. This will get worse before better." I said, "I survived worse than truth. I can handle this." Sarah said, "Then we wait for official response." I said, "Waiting is fine. Truth always arrives." Lucas said, "It is already in motion." I said, "Then everything is finally starting." Sarah said, "Yes, and there is no stopping it." I said, "Good. I want them to face it." Lucas said, "They will." I said, "Then let it happen." Sarah said, "Notices are out." I said, "Then it has begun." Courier left the building as I realized everything had officially changed forever now in my life. Now, the investigation became public and everyone started talking. Lucas said, "This is spreading faster than expected." Sarah said, "We need to stay ahead of this." Ryan said, "I messed up, but I'm fixing it." My mother said, "Everyone is judging me everywhere I go." I said, "You all created this situation." Olivia said, "I did not think it would go this far." Derek said, "I am done. I have to protect myself." Lucas said he is abandoning her to save himself. Sarah said, "Evidence is strong and cases are building quickly." I said, "Everything is collapsing around them now." My mother said, "I never thought it would end like this." Ryan said, "I will testify if needed." Lucas said, that changes everything legally. Sarah said, the court will decide everything now. I said, justice is finally catching up. Derek said, I cannot take this pressure anymore. Olivia said, this is all falling apart. Lucas said, they are losing control completely. Sarah said, legal penalties may be severe. I said, then they will face consequences. My mother said, I am scared of what comes next. Ryan said, we cannot undo what happened. Lucas said, no, but we can correct it. Sarah said, it is already in motion. I said then, karma has arrived. Lucas said, yes, and it is only beginning. Olivia said, I never expected this outcome. Derek said, I am leaving immediately. Sarah said, he is protecting himself now. Lucas said, that is betrayal in real time. I said, everything they built is collapsing. My mother said, I regret everything I did. Ryan said, we should have listened earlier. Sarah said, it is too late for that. Lucas said, justice always arrives eventually. I said, and now it has arrived here. Olivia said, please, I did not mean all this. Sarah said, intent does not erase evidence. Derek said, I am done talking. I need a lawyer. Lucas said, then the system will handle you both. I said, there is nothing left to say. My mother said, I feel the world turning against me. Ryan said, I will face whatever comes. Sarah said, final rulings will come soon. Lucas said, we are done here for now. I said, then let it end the way it should. Olivia said, this is not the end for me. Sarah said, it already is legally. Lucas said, the case is stronger every hour. I said, then let every truth come out. My mother said, I cannot believe this is happening. Ryan said, it is finally over for us. Sarah said, not over, just beginning consequences. I said, then I will face all of it. Lucas said, stay steady until the end. Now, I met Olivia at a quiet cafe months after everything collapsed. She looked down at her cup and said she needed to tell me the truth. I said, I am listening now. Olivia said, I never expected you to come back alive. I said, keep going. She said, I was afraid and I made terrible choices. I asked, what choices? Olivia said, I had an affair with Derek and I helped with the money plans. I said, so everything was planned. She said, yes, I thought you were gone forever. I said, and the money? Olivia said, I wanted a new life with Derek. Emma Brooks sat beside me and said, I am here to handle the papers. I said, just make it final. Olivia said, please, I still love you. I said, love without loyalty is nothing. Olivia said, I never meant to hurt you. I said, but you did. She said, I regret everything. I said, regret is not repair. Emma said, sign here when ready. I signed papers quietly. Olivia said, are you really leaving me? I said, I already left a long time ago. Emma said, divorce is now legally complete once filed. I stood up. Olivia said, wait, please. I said goodbye, Olivia. I walked away. I felt the weight of everything settle as I reached the door. Emma said, you did the right thing for yourself. I said, maybe, but it still hurts. Olivia said, I will change, I swear. I said, some promises come too late. Emma said, we are finished here. I thought about everything we had been through. Olivia said, you were my whole life. I said, and you destroyed what we had. Emma said, papers are now officially submitted. I stepped outside into the open air, feeling free for the first time. I told Lucas it was finally over. Lucas said, you look lighter now. I said, I feel like I can breathe again. Emma said, closure is not forgetting, it is moving forward. Olivia said, I lost everything. I said, you lost it the moment you chose betrayal. I looked at her one last time. Olivia said, please remember me differently. I said, I will remember the truth. Emma said, it is done now. I walked away knowing I would never return. Lucas said, this is your new beginning. I said, no, this is my freedom. Sarah said, the case is officially closed. I said, then everything is finally over. I heard the cafe noise fading behind me. Emma said, Sign of completion is in the file. I said then, keep it sealed. Olivia said I loved you in my own way. I said I no longer needed love that came with betrayal, and I walked away from the cafe, leaving behind every promise, every lie, every broken memory, and stepping into a future that was mine alone, where truth mattered more than anything they had ever offered me in my entire life, and I finally was truly free. Through veteran support programs, I started meeting Emma Brooks regularly. Emma said, "You don't have to pretend here, just talk." I replied, "I'm not used to that anymore." She said, "Then start now." I told her, "I don't know who I am without everything that happened." Emma said, "Then we figure it out step by step." I nodded because it was the first time someone didn't demand answers from me. Ryan called one evening and said, "I'm still trying to fix what I broke." I said, "Fixing takes more than words." He replied, "I know, but I'm not stopping." I didn't answer right away, then said, "Just don't expect forgiveness quickly." My mother said during a visit, "I didn't understand what I was doing back then." I said, "Understanding now doesn't erase it." She looked down and said, "I know, but I want peace between us." I replied, "Peace takes time." Emma later asked, "Do you feel anger every day?" I said, "Not like before. It comes and goes." She said, "That's progress." I started volunteering with other veterans. One of them said, "You look like you've been through hell." I replied, "I have, but I'm still here." He said, "That's what matters." Emma said, "You're helping people without realizing it." I replied, "I'm just talking." She said, "That's exactly why it works." Ryan met me again and said, "I'm trying to be better than who I was." I said, "Then prove it through actions, not promises." He nodded quietly. My mother said softly, "Can we ever be a family again?" I said, "Different maybe, not the same." She accepted that without arguing. Emma asked, "Do you trust anyone now?" I said, "Not easily, but I'm learning." She smiled and said, "That's all I wanted to hear." I began to notice something changing inside me. The weight of betrayal didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling every thought. One evening, a veteran told me, "Talking about it makes it lighter." I said, "I used to think silence was stronger." He replied, "Silence just keeps it inside." Emma said, "You're not just surviving anymore, you're rebuilding." I said, "I don't feel rebuilt yet." She said, "But you're standing, and that counts." Ryan said during another meeting, "I wish I could undo everything." I said, "We all do, but we can't live there." He replied, "So what do we do?" I said, "We move forward." My mother quietly said, "I see a different version of you now." I said, "Maybe I finally stopped running from myself." Emma looked at me one day and said, "You should tell your story." I said, "Why would anyone listen?" She replied, "Because it's not just pain, it's survival." I stayed silent for a moment. Then I said, "I'm not ready yet." She said, "You don't have to be ready forever, just ready enough to begin." For the first time, I didn't reject the idea. I just considered it. Emma smiled and said, "Think about it. Your story might help more people than you realize." I didn't answer immediately, but I knew something inside me had already started changing. At a veterans event, I stood before the crowd and said, "I never thought I would make it back from war, but I did." Today, I want to tell you what survival really means. I said, it is not just about coming home alive. It is about what happens after. Ryan sat in the front row and I said, "He knows my story better than anyone." My mother cried quietly as she listened, and I said, "I forgive you, but I cannot forget." Olivia stood at the back watching, and I said, "Some people lose you twice, once in life and once in truth." Emma said, "Tell them what you learned." I said, "I learned that survival is not enough. You have to live again. War did not break me, but coming home almost did." Lucas said, "You made it through everything." I said, "I lost my family, my marriage, and my trust. But I found myself." Sarah said, Your case changed everything for others. I said, then it was worth it. Olivia moved forward and said, I am sorry. I said, sorry is not enough, but it is a start. The event ended, and I stepped outside into the cool air and said, this is the first time I feel free. Emma walked beside me and said, you are not the same man who left for war. I said, no, I am not. That man died somewhere along the way. Lucas said, or he evolved into someone stronger. I said, maybe I finally became real. Sarah said, what will you do now? I said, I will help others like me. I will speak the truth, even when it hurts. Olivia quietly said, will you ever come back? I said, no, my life is forward now. My mother looked at me and said, I am proud of who you became. I said, I am still healing, but I am standing. Emma said, that is enough for today. I said, for the first time I believe that too. Lucas said, so what is next for you? I said, a new beginning without fear. Without lies, without betrayal. Sarah said, then you are finally free. I said, I have been free since I chose truth. Olivia nodded slowly and said, goodbye. I said, goodbye is what we both needed. The night sky looked different as I walked away. I said, I am not broken anymore. I am rebuilding. Emma said, that is your real victory. I said, victory is not revenge, it is peace. Lucas said, we all saw you change. I said, change was painful, but necessary. Sarah said, your story will help many. I said, then let it be shared. Emma said, are you ready to tell the world? I said, yes, I am ready now. Then start with honesty. I looked at everything behind me and said, my past does not define me anymore. I walked forward knowing I had survived betrayal, loss, and pain, and I still chose life over darkness. I understood that survival was not the end of my story, but only the beginning of my new life now.